So what I'm going to do today is I'm just going to talk about a couple of papers connected by a common theme. As Dan said, these papers are about racial bias, but I hope you can see that ultimately the point I'm trying to make is not about racial bias. I've known Dan for such a long time that he doesn't want me to put the number down on how long I've known him. And the first paper that I want to talk about is almost that old. This is a paper that I did actually when I was a junior faculty member at MIT. And it was actually quite fun. What we did was we sent out a bunch of resumes for help wanted ads saying, hey, I'd like this job, in effect. These resumes were made up. They were made up to be realistic, but they were made up. And there were thousands of them in their variety. The reason we did that was because, well, tenure is a low probability event, and I just want to cover my, no, that's not why we did that. We did that because before we sent out the resumes, we made one change. Half of the resumes were sent out with names like Brendan Miller, and the other half of the resumes were sent out with names like Jamal Jones. So that is, these are statistically identical resumes. The only difference is half of them had a name that's associated with being white, and half of them had a name that was associated with being black. What we found was that having a white-sounding name led to 50% more callbacks. That is just an enormous number. If you translate that into unemployment rates, that would mean actually what we actually see in the United States. African Americans have about a 1/3 higher unemployment rate than whites, which at least just from this alone would explain that. People have now done this. There was an awesome study from a team at Berkeley that did this at some massive scale, and you tend to see these type of effects pretty large continuing. So that's study one, okay? It basically showed large amounts of racial discrimination. Now, flash forward, this is a study from very recently, like 3 years ago, I guess, 4 years ago. And this is about in healthcare. And to understand this second study, you just need to know something about the institution of healthcare. So most of you go to the doctor, you show up, you wait in the emergency room for a long time. It's a pain in the ass. That's a technical term. But there's something called care coordination programs. Care coordination programs exist because for some people, they have such extensive healthcare needs that they go to the hospital and go to the health system a lot. There's a metaphor here, which is that because these patients are the epicenter of healthcare, you really need to treat them differently. Healthcare people really dislike what I'm about to say, but it really works. It's like a frequent flyer program for the health system. So if you're in a care coordination program, just like in a frequent flyer program, you don't have to wait in the usual line. There's a separate line. There's a separate number you call before you even go in. And they say, don't bother coming in or definitely come in. It's a bunch of wrapper services that help people with lots of chronic conditions give them extra resources. Okay, so these programs are practiced everywhere. Pretty much every health system in the world, in the United States, has one. Now, here's the interesting thing most people don't realize. To target who gets into these programs, it's largely done by an algorithm. They're sort of different algorithms built by different people, but they're all in spirit the same thing. And what's funny about this algorithm is that it's being applied to about 100 million patients. So what this program does is it targets people, patients, who are in extra need of these resources, and it says, let's give it to them. So what we did was we took one of these algorithms, and we decided to measure the racial inequity in that algorithm. So you can see we did it with people and resumes at first, but now, flash forward 20 years later, it's like the same song again, this time with an algorithm. And what we did was we had access to this large private sector algorithm that has consequences for who's actually going to get in the program. And what we wanted to know was what kind of white and black patients are chosen by the algorithm for the program. One easy way to see it is the algorithm gives you a score. For this patient, here's their need or riskiness to get into the program. If you're in the top 3%, you automatically get enrolled. A little bit lower than that, someone looks at you a little bit more carefully and makes some choices. So all I'm going to show you is I'm going to show you, given the score on the x-axis, how sick were the patients. And this is what we found. So the good news, the algorithm works. Higher score, sicker. Bad news, at every level of the score, white patients are less sick than black patients. So another way of seeing it is if we choose the auto-enrollment threshold, which is 97%, you find that blacks have 28% more chronic illnesses at that auto-enrollment threshold. And this is true of many other health outcomes. I've just picked this one. In fact, if you want to see how big the effect is, let's say I zoomed into that part and I said, I want to equalize this. I want to take the marginal black person who's sick and I want to swap them out to the marginal white person who's less sick. And I'm going to keep swapping until I get equality at the margin. If I did that, so I'm going to add and remove. The top is the black patients, add, remove the white patients until I get to the same health. The fraction of blacks enrolled in this program goes from 17% to 36%. Another huge disparity. We would double the number of blacks auto-enrolled in this program. The previous one was about a form of livelihood. This is about life and death. All right, so the first study was an audit study. The second study was a sort of health algorithm study. I'm telling you these two studies because if you think about it, in some sense they're trying to accomplish the same thing. They're trying to assess a decision-making system and ask how much racial inequity is in the decision-making system. But there's obviously one key difference. The decision-making system on the left, at the time it was done, was an entirely human decision-making system. The decision-making system on the right was an entirely algorithmic system, at least the part that we studied. So we are assessing two decision-making systems, one by people, one by algorithms, both of which are showing this striking racial bias. And can we understand something by comparing at least my experience in trying to do these two activities? And how does that help us understand how we should think about algorithms and how we should think about people? So I want to compare and contrast these two experiences. And I hope you'll get the sense that I'm not doing this in a very narrow sense. I'm just hoping these two serve as a metaphor for illustrating something that I'm noticing across many different contexts. Okay, so let's start with the first one. So let's talk about the first thing that you must do in any context is you got to uncover the problem. In this case, you have to uncover that there's bias. Right? And in other cases, it'll be other stuff. Let's just understand what that looked like in both parts of this study. So for the audit study, I have to tell you, this is the closest I've ever come to feeling like I'm running some sort of clandestine spy operation. Like I had an army of RAs, we set up fake phone numbers, fake resumes. The RAs from that period, from 20 years ago, still email me and say, oh, that was so fun. But it was a lot of work. Because you have to make stuff up. And you got to like run this whole operation. So it was, to say, hard. And not just hard, at some level unsatisfying. Because you'll notice I could only talk about callbacks. Many of you may say, well, what about at the interview stage? Oh, okay, well, that's really hard because my fake resumes don't like to be interviewed. So I don't know, what do I do then? Of course, people have audit studies there too, but now it gets a lot more complicated. You got to hire people and actors and actresses and make sure that it gets harder. And people have done it, but it gets hard. The health algorithm was a combination of very hard and very straightforward. The very hard part was getting access to the algorithm. That's very hard. Without that, you really can't do much. But once you have access to that, it was a straightforward statistical exercise where I put straightforward in the sense that we now have tools to do this stuff. It would be even easier if someone had actually not just given us the prediction algorithm, but the actual training algorithm and the data. But having said that, on the right-hand side, it is noteworthy, there is a bit more straightforwardness on the right. Again, conditional on someone actually giving us what we need to do it. Okay, now let's talk about having uncovered the problem, having uncovered that there is a problem, understanding why there's a problem. You'll notice that On the left, 20 years after this, I don't think we still have very definitive answers as to the sources of bias. Since that paper, there was a lot of discussion in the employment literature on, is there implicit bias? Is it, you can imagine, but it's ongoing because human processes are messy. If you're very familiar and you live in the world of algorithms, it's normal to say, oh, these very complex algorithms are inscrutable. But the human mind is extremely inscrutable. People will sometimes say to me, well, you can always ask a person. So you're telling me I should ask the person screening the resume, do you discriminate? I mean, I'll do it, but I can tell you what you find. All right, what about the health algorithm? Where is the algorithm going wrong? Well, this is a little bit more detective work, but it's detective work in the box. So what we did was we said, let's actually look and see where the algorithm is going right. It turns out that I can show you the same graph, x-axis score, y-axis something, and I find no racial bias. This is that. What's on the y-axis? Money, cost, expenditures. Actually turns out the error is an almost comical error that is tragic. See, in healthcare, when we talk about the health of people, it's all health as it's measured. But how do we measure health? Well, there are two ways of measuring health. One way of measuring health is what I showed you in the previous graph. You actually go and get physiological measures of health. That's not the most common way of measuring health, you'd be surprised to learn. The most common way of measuring health is what? It's care delivered. But care delivered is not a measure of health per se, it's a proxy for health that is about health plus access to care. And when I put on the y-axis care delivered, there is no bias. This appears to be what the algorithm is being trained on, and it's very well calibrated. And what you find is that, in fact, what am I pushing up here? That if you look at, it's just generally known, whites have access to better health care. So at every level of actual physiological health, they're getting more care, but more care makes them look, quote, sicker. And so that's, blacks utilize less health care, costs less, so they will look less sick. Hence the problem. Accurate cost prediction equals biased health prediction. And it turns out once you have that, you at least have given, again, I'm going to emphasize, given access to the algorithm, you can actually do that. Now let's talk about fixing the bias. Well, these are a bunch of audit studies of the type that I've described. I haven't added the latest one, this great one from this Berkeley team from 2020, I guess, 2021. And on the y-axis is the gap, and you'll see almost nothing is changing. The gap is the same today when you do this audit study at scale as what we found. Literally the same, which is depressing as all hell. Because we've known about this. People teach these papers. HR people teach these papers as part of training. But not much has changed. That is really depressing, that you can take the same resume study and run it today and find the exact same effect. In contrast, when you look at the racial bias thing, it turns out now that we know the problem, we ourselves developed a method. And it's just a simple thing, which is by knowing you've got this other objective, it turns out you can combine health with cost measures and do pretty well and get basically the same kind of effect with almost no racial gap. And now there's a bunch of health systems and algorithm manufacturers that want to adopt and fix their algorithms. I'm not saying that that's a panacea, but for example, now regulators want to get in and make sure that people are actually implementing the fixes. And again, that's not necessarily going to solve the problem, but it does mean that there's now a machinery that can kick in where I'm more optimistic that in 20 years, we won't be saying, isn't it silly these care coordination algorithms are racially biased. So it's not a technocratic matter, it's a matter of political and policy will. Whereas on the left-hand side, we still don't quite know what to do even if we had the political and policy will. Okay. So at each stage, uncovering the source of bias, understanding the source of bias, and fixing the bias, I just want to point out that it's easier to uncover the bias in algorithms than it is in humans, as I'll say it again, with proper regulations. It's easier to understand the source of bias, and it's easier to fix the biases. So, and I hope you see the lessons are more general than bias. I deliberately picked something optimistic, not because I don't think algorithms can't do a lot of harm. They can do an immense amount of harm. Think of how insane it is that 100 million people, roughly, had their health being dictated by this poorly built algorithm. That's absurd. But I hope you get the sense that when we talk about algorithms, we should talk about people. When we talk about X is hard with algorithms are inscrutable, we should talk about are people inscrutable? That is, we need to understand that there are immense problems with these fragile algorithms, but we live in a decision-making system where there are decisions being made by fallible people. And if we're going to try to understand how to integrate these two, we have to both understand the fallibility of people and the fragility of algorithms and figure out how to combine them so we get the best of both. And I think that I'll end on one small note, which is look this way. I'm in no way trying to say, let's automate stuff, that's not what I'm trying to say. I just think we need a richer model of people and a richer model of algorithms. And when you realize that, you realize the design space, the ways in which we can use algorithms opens up dramatically. I'll give you one tiny paper on that just to give you a sense of it. So this is a paper on knee pain. So osteoarthritis is actually the most common joint disorder in the US. Quite a few people who are older have it. It's basically degeneration of the cartilage in the knee. Now, the striking fact that most people don't realize is if you take knee pain, it's much more common amongst the disadvantaged in the United States. Much more common amongst blacks, much more common amongst poor people. Now, we could ask, why is this happening? And it's kind of, if you're interested in poverty and inequity, it's one of the more important things that you should care about, because it means, above everything else, being poor or black in America means living with more pain on a day-to-day basis. So people have thought about this a lot, and I would say there are two explanations that have come up. The first is, well, of course, people who are more disadvantaged do jobs that are more demanding, and their knees have more problems. There's a problem inside their knees that's different. The second perspective is that there's something outside their knees, less access to pain medication, less access to social support. How do we test these hypotheses? Very easy. We get a data set where we know how severe the knee problem is, and we see whether the pain differences persist. And in fact, when you do that, x-axis severity, y-axis, this is not my fault. The official pain measurement, called the Kruse pain score, has the property that the lower the number, the more the pain. That's not on me. So I am not going to be blamed for this. But what that means is, as the disease gets worse, there's more pain, but there's always a gap at every level. So there's something inside their heads, some social structure, something outside their knees. That's been the interpretation in this literature. But is that really true? Who decided that that's the measure of severity? Well, people decided that that's the measure of severity. Well, who is it? Osteoarthritis, doctors looking at it. But that's the human eye looking at this thing. It's the medical literature, which if you go back and look at the original Kruse score, or the original KLG score for severity, that was a study done all on white people in England. Well, I can't say that it's done on all on white people. They don't even report the racial distribution because it was just taken as given that that's the racial distribution. Why would anyone want to know? So let's ask the question, can we actually use algorithms differently here? So to do that, let's do a second look. Let's train a ComNet to look at the X-ray, but this time it's going to take the input as the image of the knees, and it's going to predict what the person says, not what the doctor says. It's actually beautifully evocative. It's an algorithm listening to the patient. Okay, so the key is the algorithm only sees the X-ray, does not see the race of the person, doesn't know anything. And now we get a measure of severity as measured by pain correlated with some physical thing in the X-ray. When we do that and put that on the x-axis, so the left hand is the original severity score. When we use this new measure, the gap completely disappears. What that means is when people were saying there's something wrong with my knee and we said, no, no, it's something else, no, there was something wrong with their knee. It's just medicine didn't notice that. It's what patients have been trying to tell us all along. And this, I hope you see, it's because bias was built into the structure of medical knowledge. I'm not going to propose using this algorithm as an aid or necessarily, but it's as a diagnostic to help us understand, holy cow, this whole area of medicine has been not listening to disadvantaged people for quite some time, and we've not even tried to create drugs to solve this problem. That gives you a sense, I hope, of the bigger design space here. There's a lot to love and a lot to lament about algorithms, but there's a lot to love and a lot to lament about people. And I think poorly designed algorithm can magnify the worst of our tendencies. If we simply automated what the radiologist would say about knees, we would have automated that bias. But I think well-designed algorithms could end up covering for our mistakes. If we say, don't listen to what I say about the X-ray, look at what is in the X-ray, maybe we learn something about ourselves. And that's what I hope is a hopeful ending to thinking there is something good that we can do by thinking of well-built algorithms that cover for our mistakes. All right, thank you.
Super, thanks. Maybe one quick question if there is one.
Sure, I'll ask a question. I just wondered whether there was a algorithmic solution to your human problem of the resume bias. In particular, I thought people had tried algorithmically redacting the name and gender pronouns from a resume. You know, is that something that we could, you know, more companies could do and so forth, and would that have an effect?
I think it's a great question. I think it goes back to thinking of the bigger design space. I think that that kind of thing is a place where the algorithm can, if we knew about the nature of the bias, help us change our decision architecture to deal with the bias. I think redacting the name alone might not be the specific thing I chose. For example, later in the process, there will be an interview. But it's definitely the case that we could think about re-architecting the human screening process along with some aids to kind of undo the bias, which I think is exactly expanding the design space. All right.